Daf Kaftet Amud Bet, 29b, 3 lines from the bottom of the page. זה הכלל היה במקדש. In בית המקדש there is a rule called רחיצה. רחיצה meaning you have to be respectful, you have to wash. But there are different category of washing, and don't mix it with any other concept. We are talking about רחיצה solely, washing. Two different things. One, it's called קידוש ידיים ורגליים, sanctification of hands and legs. And the other one, it's called tvila, really ducking in the mikveh. We explained that there are two different categories. One, if person have the need for urination, then the kohen needs קידוש ידיים ורגליים, which is רחיצה, to wash his hand and legs. Soon you see why. When it's come to great need for bathroom, then he needs to clean himself, to duck himself in the mikveh, and we elaborate that. But just remember, as the Meiri tells us, that it's all come from the din of רחיצה. בישלמה רגליים משום ניצוצות על הידיים הייתמה. So the question is, we understand you need to wash your legs, your feet, because maybe think ancient time. You go on a journey, you stop in a side road. So as a male, you know that sometimes is sparkle coming out. So we understand it maybe hits your feet. So you need to wash. But what's the purpose of the hand? אמר רבי אבא, זאת אומרת, מצווה לשפשף, page 38. That it's a rabbinic mitzvah. When you have a situation that you have a drop of urinate from one's leg, so the same way, it's a mitzvah to לשפשף, to brush. And therefore he said, מסייע לרבי עמיד, אמר רבי עמי, אסור לאדם שיצא בניצוצות שעל גבי רגליו מפני שיראה כחוט שפחה ומוציא לעד בניו שממזרים. Again, it was a very strong concept, especially at that time, that if a person have an issue, it's called in the Torah k'hut shafcha, which means he looks like he's not able to deliver the urinate properly. He is also have an issue with having a normal relationships, and as a result, people may think that his children is not his. So therefore, you have to be careful. I want to elaborate, if you give me a moment, something, especially we have Sephardic students, just as a sign, nice note. The Ben Ish Chai, the great sage Sephardic rabbi in the past generation, live in Baghdad. So he wrote a book called Ben Ish Chai, and in the second year, Shana Shniya, Parshat Metzorah, he has a very large section in regards to washing hands. And he has a long form of L'Shem Yichud, what one should say before washing hands. And he holds that for Netilat Yadayim, for the Seudah, for regular time, that washing hands, you should do 3 in each hands, and then you should do the shifshuf, each hands the other way around, to make sure the water cover the hand in full. And he brought sources for that, but it's mainly Kabbalistic sources by his attitude. But back to our subject, so since we learned in a Mishnah that the Kohen who's have a need for the bathroom, so he needs to duck himself in a mikveh in order to remove any type of feces on his body. So the question is, Marav Ramshenburg asked, what's the reason that we mix in here in our discussion tzoah, feces? So he explains that because, and I just read it from the source, משום דקטני מתניתין כל המסך רגליו טעון טבילה, דטעמה שמא נשארה צואה על בשרו, לאחי מאי תיאחה, צד, עיקר מקומו שהרפק משמדו. So he explained that there is a special chapter which we study, the 3rd chapter in the Tractate Brachot, that dealing with all kind of situation when it's proper to do the service, prayer, service, rituals, etc. But here he said, because it happens that some people are not totally in a state of cleaning, only if the body totally duck in the mikveh, that you make sure that is full clean. אמר רב פאפא, צואה במקומה, אסור לקרוא קריאת שמע. So the Mishnah Berurah said that it's not just Kriyat Shema, it's also to pray or to say anything in Kedusha, that if you have in his the rectum some left, he cannot say recite Shema or prayer. So we want to be clear on that. If you see it as for sure that it's prohibited. But if you don't see it, what are you expecting the person? The Torah is not belong to an angel, so how you expect the person to take care of that? So Gemara said, Lo tzricha deyoshev v'nir'ed. So when a person see it, he can see it. Omed ve'na nir'ed. When he stand, you don't see it. V'umayshna mitzual besaro. So what's the difference between that and you have on his flesh the feces? Ditmar tzual besaro or sheyoda v'bet hakiseh. So in other words, in those days they have a special ancient way that they Rav Huna Amar mutar likro Kriyat Shema, Rav Chizda Amar asur Kriyat Shema. The machloket if you're allowed to recite Shema under this condition. Rav Huna hold that you can recite Shema under this condition because the only the mouth and the nose are praiseworthy Hashem, that you basically breathing to them, but it's not the other part of the body. Rav Chizda said asur likro Kriyat Shema. You cannot say it because since it's something on his part of the body as a whole is one body, so therefore you cannot do that. So he said, Bimkoma nafish zuama. So in that place, in the rectum, so it's a great, carry a great odor. Shelo bimkoma lo nafish zuama. So that type is not a disputation between Rav Huna and Rav Chizda. Tanu Rabbanan halacha besuda. We add something in regards to a regular eating meal. So Rashi said here, Klomar halacha zo amru b'ilchot seuda. So I explained in my book, Biurei Klomar b'Rashi al Hashas, that the language on the Braita, it's a very short language. So you may think that that's applied to a certain halacha within the meal. So Rashi said, halacha, Klomar halacha zo amru b'ilchot seuda. It's just incorporated as part of Hilchot Seuda. Hilchot Seuda, you learn from here, and you shouldn't learn it from other sources. Adam hayotze להשתין מים, נוטל ידו אחת, ונכנס. So a person go out and urinate, so he needs to wash originally one hand. When the spark come out from, and then he needs to return. דיבר עם חברו והפליג. Sometimes he went out and he has a long conversation with his body, with his friends. Notel shte yadav v'nichnas. Since he has a sachat adat, his mind is not so much with the seuda, his mind with the conversation that the two friends have outside. So therefore, he needs to wash both hands. The King Solomon put a decree that the hands is called shniyot letum'ah. So it means that someone who is attached to avatuma, he become the second. It's rishon, the first one, and one who touch the first one become the second one. So therefore, it's not make impure something that is non-consecrated, but it's invalid the truma. So why? Because they say a daimaskaniot, and the hand is always active, is always moving. וכשהוא נוטל, לא ייטול מבחוץ וייכנס מפני חשד. So he shouldn't wash his hand outside and enter because people think that he didn't wash his hand. אלא נכנס ויושב במקומו, he entered and sit on his place, ונוטל שתי ידיו, and he wash his hands, ומחזיר התפיח על האורחים. And he returned that vessel, that's a nagel vessel, that's a vessel for washing water for the guest. And he asked, is anyone who needs to wash their hands? And therefore, everyone understands that he's just entered to that meal. The Gemarrah circumscribed, limited the end of the Braita. The Gemarrah said, Amar Rav Chizda lo amaran ela lishtot. All these, Rashi said at the end of the Suda, they used to drink. So that's applied to drinking. Even for the purpose of drinking, you don't need to wash hands. Here, you need to, because Rashi explains that maybe it's a person put a slice of something, bread or something in his mouth, or they said that the Ritva and Tosfot Rosh said that because he have a large hefsek, the large part that wasn't involved with eating, aval le'echol, but if in return there in order to eat, notel mibachutz v'nichnas, so he can go outside, he can wash his hand outside of that domain and enter. Vadai, the whole idea is that people not suspect it. The Meidei Adia, they are ninadate. So they think that he is fastidious. He will not touch the food without washing his hands. So therefore, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Va'ana, he says, and me, afilu lishtot nami. Even I hold that even in order to drink, you can wash outside. Meidei Adia ninadate. Because everyone knows that I am very fussy, very fastidious. So therefore, no one suspected me that I didn't wash my hands. So even for drinking, I'll do that. Mishnah, in continuation to the previous Mishnah on page 28, now is another point how the person prepare himself for the work. En adam nichnas la'azara la'avodah. A person should not enter do the holy temple courtyard for the temple service. Afilu tahor chidbol. Even he's pure until he immerses in the mikveh. The Gemara explained what's the reason. I always tell you stories. When I was a kid, a few days ago, so in the summertime we have what is called, it's like Keitana, it's like a little camp. Mm-hmm. So in Haifa, and it was a big Hasidic sect called Gur. They have a very big shtibel, big shul. So the Beit Yisrael, the great Hasidic Rabbi, used to visit my late grandfather and used to come there. So I went to the teacher and I said, I want to get the blessing from the Rabbi. I was maybe 6 years old, 7 years old. So I remember the teacher said, our rule is only people who duck themselves in the mikveh can go and get the blessings. So I you know, as a little kid, so 5, 6 years old, to make long story short, I get the blessing, but in a different way. I went to my grandpa, and he used to visit him, so I get the blessing. Anyway, there is a rule in certain places that you don't enter before, no matter what you condition, before you duck yourself in a mikveh. Chamesh tvilot, now we talk about ducking ourselves in a mikveh, in a Seder Avodah, in the preparation of Yom Kippur. So 5 ducking in a mikveh, v'asara kiddushim, and you have here the 10 times that they immerse himself for the hands and the legs. Tovel kohen gadol mekadesh bo bayom. The high priest does in the day of atonement in this dikon. The Gemara will explain in the time, etc. Vechulan bakodesh al gaga bet parva. It was he does that in a special place in the courtyard. The Meiri said, and it was a special mikveh, a ritual bath, that the top of the roof of place called Beta Parva, chutz, except mizo bilvad. So they follow the Torah that he should wash his flesh in the sacred place in the Vayikra and Leviticus 16, excluding the first one that he does outside of the courtyard. Parsu sadin shel butz beino leben ha'am, and they put, in order to have a modesty, the Meiri said it was like a sadin, a sheet of fine linen between him and the people in the interest of modesty. And then the high priest immersed himself, and this is a different girsaot, kidesh adav raglav, it's different girsaot. I remember after I got married, when they build a mikveot, my late father-in-law used to build and help to building a lot of mikveot. So I remember whenever it's Friday and we went to the mikveh, that we schedule in a way that we don't see each other. So that's part of the idea in modesty. Shalu et ben Zoma. They ask a ben Zoma. Remember Ben Zoma from the Mishnayot. So he's a man that was a giant, a public orator, a speaker, never married, etc. So they ask him, Tvilal zo this idea of immerse himself in a mikveh, that the Mishnah referring, that every single person that enter to a courtyard to duck himself, lama, why a Kohen needs to do it. Amar lahem, Uma meshane mikodesh lekodesh, if the high priest during the Day of Atonement move from one sacred place to another, ממקום שאנוש כרת למקום שאנוש כרת, if he enter with his ritual impurity, he moved from a place that he deserved the punishment of karet. Karet meaning the soul can cut off by heaven. So if he entered that domain, one is, in other words, the high priest used to duck himself anytime he changed to the location, the place that he walks. So in other words, when he's done with the golden garments, and he moved to the other place in the sanctuary, he constantly duck himself. Ta'un tvila, he needs to duck. Hameshane mechol hakodesh, when he derived from, in a simple way, non-sacred or secular to the sacred, which means he come from his house to the holy place of the courtyard. Umemakom shel anush karet lemakom shel anush karet, if he enter with the ritual impurity from a place that not deserve the punishment of karet to a place that deserve punishment karet, that someone who entered the courtyard deserve karet if he is not ritually impure. And no din shetaun tvila, for sure he needs to duck himself. So Rabbi Yehuda disagreed. He said, serech tvila hizo, kedei shizkor tmura shel shana v'yifrosh. So he said that that's not called a total immersion. He called it appear like ancillary immersion, which means it's not a mitzvah. It's instituted that so that one will remember any old impurity that he contact and withdraw. So when in time that he do this type of immersion, he will remember if he is exposed to any source of 7-day impurity and will refrain from serving in a Beit HaMikdash. What exactly the source, or what exactly the difference in this disputation between Ben Zoma and Rabbi Yehuda? When it was a desecration and as a result disqualification of service, so if the service of the pure Kohen, that he didn't duck himself, that makes him invalid or not. לבין זומא מחל עבודה, לרבי יהודה לא מחל עבודה. According to Ben Zoma, that make the work disqualified, and since he didn't duck himself, it's not good. Rabbi Yehuda said that since this idea of ducking himself is only rabbinic, so since it's rabbinic, if b'diavad, if after the fact he did not duck himself and he did the work, it still don't disqualify this type of work. The Gemarrah rejected and said, "U'leben zoma mi mechel." So you tell me, according to Ben Zoma, it's totally desecrated and disqualified. V'atani kohen gadol shelo taval v'lo kidesh ben beged lebeged. If kohen gadol did not duck himself between changing from a gold clothing that was doing the year round to the white garments on Yom Kippur and vice versa, uben avodah la'avodah. All those ducking has to take place between different types of work. Avodato kshera. After the fact, his work is okay, is accepted. Echad kohen gadol v'echad kohen idiot. There's no difference between a high priest and a regular priest. Shelo kidesh adav rak lav shacharit v'avad avodah avodato psula. So if he didn't sanctify his hands and feet in the morning, so if he walks regardless if it's Yom Kippur the rest of the year, we don't accepted his avodah, his work. So Ben Zoma teaches us that it is an obligation to duck himself for someone who's pure before he does any type of work in Yom Kippur. But the avad, if it, after the fact, so he said that it's accepted. So the difference between if the pure Kohen that didn't duck himself before the work he is violating a positive commandment, לבין זומא קאי בעשה, which means that a Kohen Gadol that did not, even he is ritually pure, but did not duck himself between changing the different type of work, changing the garment, he is in violation of positive commandment. That's what Ben Zoma meant. And the same applied to someone who's ritually impure, that he didn't duck himself. Why? Rabbi Yehuda lokai be'aseh. Rabbi Yehuda hold that all the idea of ducking himself in a mikveh is rabbinic. So therefore, if he didn't do it, it's not considering a violation of positive biblical commandment. Umit leRabbi Yehuda isvara. Do you tell me that Rabbi Yehuda hold that way, that anyone who entered the sanctuary has to have a ritual immersion? V'atanya, we learn in a Braita in regards to a leper, metzora tovel v'omed b'shar nikarno. At the 8 days after the leper was pure, he bring his offering. Even he duck himself for the 7th day, and he enter in the gate Nikanor, which we said several times, that gate, in order to enter his hand and legs in. So in order to have the feet and the thumb from that blood of the asham and the oil, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, אינו צריך טבילה. At the 8th day, the leper doesn't need to duck himself, שכבר טבל מבערב, because night before, he ducked himself at the eve of the 7th. So why he doesn't need to duck? So they said, ההוא כדתנא תמא, שכבר טבל מבערב, because he already did it on the evening before. ודקארילה, מהי קארילה? And the one who grasps this Braita as a contradiction to Rabbi Yehuda's opinions, in what manner does he grasp it? The rationale for this halacha is explicit. So they said, Mishum dekabay lemirma acharite alei, because he wants to ask from the 3rd Braita, Lishkat hametzoraim, shesham metzoraim tovlim. Why it's called the chamber of the leper? Because this is the place that the lepers immerse themselves. Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo metzorim milvad amru ela kol adam. It's not a place solely for the leper, it's applied to everyone. It's a problem because the previous Braita Rabbi Yehuda said that the leper doesn't need to duck himself for the 8 days, because he bringing his behonotav, his toes to the yard. So lo kashya haletavil hadelo tavil. So they said it's not a question, because the Braita referring to the case where the leper immersed the evening before and need not immerse again, but the other Braita referring to a case where the leper did not immerse. So in this situation, there is a case where the leper did not immerse, and therefore he could not immerse. So he needs to immerse himself for the 8 days before he entered to the courtyard. Gemarrah rejected and said, tavil. If the leper did not immerse at the 7th day the way he should be, so the immersing at the 8th day in the morning will not help him, because ha'arev shemesh bae, because he needs to have the full day to the time that it will be evening time, and up to that time he is ritually impure, he cannot enter the courtyard, and therefore he needs to duck himself that day, and he turned to be backward like 7th day, and the following day, which actually it's the 9th day, he can bring his offering. So in other words, anyone who needs to duck himself for any ritual impure needs to have the full day to the sunset, and we see the 3 stars that set, then he can bring his offering. So because of that, he can duck himself in any place, because he's not entering now to the courtyard. So Rabbi Yehuda said that the place has to be in the leper chamber solely, ela idi ve'idi de taver. In both Braitot apply that the leper duck himself when on the 7th day. ha de'asach da'atei, ha de'lo asach da'atei. The Braita that Rabbi Yehuda said that the lepers need to duck themselves in that chamber apply to the leper that he is not focusing on his body to be ritually pure after he duck himself for the 7 days. So therefore he need to redo it again on the 8th day. The second one that Rabbi Yehuda said he doesn't need to duck, it's a mean that he was totally in a focus. You know, it's very important in our lives to focus on something, because he remember his situation, and he duck himself for the 7th day, make sure that he's not engaged with any ritual impurities, so therefore he doesn't need to do it again on the 8th day. So the Gemara rejected that, said, if the leper is not pay attention carefully not to engage with ritual impurity, so the 8th day is not sufficient to purify him. Haza'at shlishi u'shvi'i ba'e. You need to have the ashes of the red heifer at the 3rd and the 7th days, as we explains, after he not focused of what he's supposed to do. That's the same as a person who purified himself from contacting with the corpse. דאמר רבי דוסטאי בר מתון אמר רבי יוחנן, הסח הדעת צריך הזעה בשלישי ושביעי. If a person did not focus totally, so he said, destruction from effort to avoid impurity requires sprinkling of purification water on the 3rd and on the 7th day in order to be purified. So the Rashi explained that it's a rabbinic commandment. The person not focused totally maybe entered the tent that he have a corpse, and therefore he become ritually impure. So that's the cause of needed for sprinkling. Ela idi v'idi. So the way that the Gemara reconciled it, they said that to the Braita we explain in regard to leper, the lo asach da'atei, that he really did not go out, he remembered the ritual impurity, and he is in a state of purity. Velo kashya had de tavil al dat biat mikdash. One time he has in his intent to enter the Beit HaMikdash, and he duck himself in order to enter, and therefore he doesn't need to duck himself again. The Braita, the Rabbi Yehuda said that the leper needs to duck himself, the lo tavil, that he didn't duck himself for the 7th day. Al dat biat mikdash, he didn't intend to duck himself in order to enter the Beit HaMikdash. So since he doesn't duck himself in a proper intent, even the duck himself, it's mo'il, it's accepted to be purified from ritual impurity of leper, he needs to redo it again on the 8 days before he enter to the sanctuary. So that's one of the rabbinic decree. They said in the Mishnah, Tractate Chagiga, page 18, V'bai teima, and if you wish, you can give another explanation. Today, you learn in the Braita without the word bilvad. So the Rabbi Yehuda said, Lo metzoraim amru. We don't say that the leper need to duck themselves, that the leper not need to duck in the mikveh. Ela kol adam. That's applied to every person who wants to enter, because that's what Rabbi Yehuda meant. Rabbi Yehuda meant that the two Braita, one said that the leper doesn't need to duck himself at the 8th day before he enter his toes to the courtyard, and this is the third explanation. Ravina Amar, Rabbi Yehuda that said that it's not only a lepers that needs to duck themselves in that place. That's according to the sages, and that's the meaning. Ledidi, according to my view, metzora en tzarich tvila. Metzora, a leper, doesn't need that the 8 days and are ducking, because he did it already the 7th day. Ledidchu oduli izi mihad. The lo metzoraim bilvad amru, that you agree with me that it's not applied solely for the lepers that need to duck themselves there. Ela kol adam, any person who enter the temple courtyard, he needs to duck himself before he entering, and he duck himself in that chamber. the Rabbanan respond to that, the sages respond to that view, and they said, Metzora de yesh betum'ah. The leper needs to duck himself another time because he gets used to ritual impurities. So since he's not careful, he's not so cautious not to, with the ritual impurity, he's not cautious after the 7th day. And therefore he become again ritually impure and he needs to duck himself again. Kol adam the lo daishe betuma. A regular person is not get used to this status of ritual impurity, therefore you don't require him to duck himself again. So, so in other words, any person who enters the courtyard does not need to duck himself before he enters, because we don't concern that he maybe does that without pay attention. They don't get used to ritual impurity. So in other words, the sages, according to this Braita, disagree and said that not everyone needs to duck himself. Only people who get used, they like lepers, etc., but not every person. Amar le'abai leRav Yosef, ne'imar Rabbanan depligi alei leRabbi Yehuda. You may say that the sages disagree with what Rabbi Yehuda said earlier, and they hold that the leper at the 8th day need to duck himself before he enters the sanctuary, and he stands in the gate of Nicanor in order to put his toes there. Kebenzoma sviralo, they hold the same as benzoma, that said that anyone who enter the courtyard, the benzoma hall, you remember that biblically speaking, benzoma said every person need to duck himself before entering, and that's the reason why the metzora, the leper, needs to duck himself at the 8 days. Even he ducked himself yesterday at the 7th day. And the fact that the Braita mentioned specifically a leper and not speaking about every other person, the express what Rabbi Yehuda meant, that even a leper doesn't need to duck himself at the 8th day. So, O Dilma, or you may say, Shane Metzora, the leper is different from all the others, the dayesh betum'ah, that he gets used to ritually impurity, and specifically in regards to a leper, the sages hold in the Braita that he needs to duck himself before enter to the sanctuary, but every other person pure that entered to the Beit HaMikdash does not need to duck himself. That's according to their opinion. The Tosfot say that the question here, the Gemarrah, if the sages hold the same as benzoma, it's not necessarily correct, but the Tosfot said the purpose of this Gemarrah is to search if the sages hold that every single person need to duck himself before entering, and it's no different between if the reason is according to benzoma, meaning that according to him is a biblical precept that every person need to duck himself, or it's follow the idea of Rabbi Yehuda, who hold that this is only a rabbinic decree. So the Tosfot said that the Gemarrah mentioned the benzoma because his point was brought earlier in a Braita. The Rambam also in Ilchot Mechusarei Kapara, chapter 4, elaborate on that, but that's what we do later in the practical halachot. So Rav Yosef responded and he said, Amar lei, Rav Yosef said to Abaye, Shane metzora de dayish betom'ah. So he said that it's different. In regard to metzora, it gets used to ritual impurity. So specifically in the leper, again, the sages said in the Braita they need to duck before he entered the Beit HaMikdash. But according to that view, the sages' opinion, it's basically one, that only leper needs to have a tevilah, duck himself before entering to a courtyard in the 8 days, because he gets used to ritual impurity, but a regular person doesn't need to do it. And they said, Rashi explains, not according to benzoma and not according to Rabbi Yehuda. Amar le Abaye le Rav Yosef. So Abaye said to Rav Yosef, it's another version. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Serech is a different version. Tvila zo, that this type of the it's not really immersion, it's ancillary immersion. It's to remind the individual of the old impurity, that's not me'ikar adin. Med Aleph 31, chotzets or eno chotzets. Chatzitza, we explained many times, is the idea of interposing. You remember when we explained to Gil, if you have a ring or you have a watch or you have anything, it's called chatzitza, it's interposition, and therefore you cannot duck himself with the mikveh. That situation. So they ask if someone have that, make it invalid, it's interposition, and he need to duck himself again or not. So they said, Amar lei, kol de takun rabanan ke'ein deoraita takun. That's a rule that applies in many places, so it's important for you to remember, so listen carefully. They said that all the sages decree, they made it in a manner of the biblical precept. So here too, in a sense of ducking himself in a mikveh, the sages decree in order to remember the old ritual impurity, and therefore its ke'ein is almost the same manners as a biblical precept. So what we said in biblical precept, if a person entered the mikveh and he carries, for example, a watch, so it's chatzitza, it's interposition, and therefore he needs to duck himself again. So they said even it's rabbinic, they made it in a category as the Torah, and therefore it's make it disqualified, it's invalidate the tefillah, and you need to do it again. And now the question they ask, Amar le Abayel Rav Yosef, bi'a b'miktzat, shma bi'a or lo? If someone enter partially to a courtyard, which means he does not enter his entire body to the courtyard, just one of his limbs, one of his body part. So that's considering as full or not. So Rashi explained that it's clear. It's like he entering. But Tosfot said that's not applied solely here. We said that it's applied to any place. Any place that if you have a partially, if it's not considering as full or not. So Amar lei behonot yochichu. If you have a leper, and you remember we said earlier that if he enter with his toes, so this proof that even part of the body of a person enter to a courtyard, the sanctity of the courtyard, it's considering like he fully entered and he need to duck himself before he entering. Shehen bi'a b'miktzat, because the toes, it's partially entering, even it's just the toes. V'tanya, metzora tovel ve'omer b'shar nikanor, that the leper, even it's just his toes, he need to duck himself first and stand in Nikanor gate in order to put there the toes. So it means that by the leper, even bi'a b'miktzat, even partially he entered there, it's already required in advance ducking himself in the mikveh. So now we elaborate, it's the last point for today. We elaborate on the whole point of ducking himself before entering the temple courtyard. So, in other words, how about if a person made a large knife standing outside of the temple courtyard and slaughtered, so the butcher needs to duck himself before doing that, since he himself is outside, just the large knife is inside. They want to exaggerate, but basically they want to derive from that the whole clarity of the concept of ducking before service. Because basically someone who slaughtered the offering, we said that he can do it even if he's physically outside of temple courtyard. We learn it, if you remember, in Zvachim, page 32b. So here, the question is, if for this type of slaughtering, he needs to duck. So now we clarify. Tibai le ben zoma, v'tibai le rabanan de pliga le Rabbi Yehuda. You have an issue by Ben Zoma point of view, that he said that the pure person needs to duck himself anyway before he enter the courtyard, biblically speaking. And is a problem with the sages that disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, and they hold specifically in the leper in 8 days, he needs to duck himself before he enter the courtyard, but the other people doesn't need. Tibai le Ben Zoma tkanu b'chev Ben Zoma ela legavai, aval lebarai lo. Only Ben Zoma require if you in, but outside no. So, Odilma atele amshuchei, and maybe because of the slaughtering he may somehow enter, he followed the knife and he entered the courtyard at the midst of slaughtering. It's also problem the other way around. The sages that disagree with Rabbi Yehuda and say, the sages did not say that this the pure person that entered the temple courtyard, excluding the leper in the 8 days, he does not need to duck himself before entering, but the lo ka'avid avodah, because he's not doing any type of work before entering. Aval hacha de ka'avid avodah, because he's slaughtering and offering, lo. So the sages did not allow him to pass without ducking himself. Or dilma loshna. Maybe he said that there's no difference, and always the pure person can enter the temple courtyard and walk even without ducking himself. Teiko, we have the teiko as a tishbi etaretz kushiyot v'ibayot, which means we solve it for the future Eliyahu Hanavi that explain to us and give us the clear answer. Today we have really many practical halachot. Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim 76. We speak about tzo'ah bimkoma or tzo'ah al besaro. So if a person needs to pray, like saying Shema, or like make any tefillah or any prayer. So they said for one who has experiments in his place, in his any place in his body, he is prohibited to recite Shema even if it's not visible when he stands. If he does recite Shema, in those circumstances he is required to recite it again. That's Mishnah Berurah. However, he is permitted to recite Shema if the experiment is not visible at all. Again, it's only b'diavad, is not lechatchila, and a person should adopt a stringent ruling in this matter. Halacha b'seuda, that's Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim 170. If a group was sharing a meal and one left to urinate, he is required to wash his hand, use the rub, the drops away. To avoid suspicion, he should wash his hands before the other participants in the meal. If he neither rubbed away any drops nor touch an unclean place, he need to wash. That's the Ramah, citing Hagaot Oshri. These halachot apply if the individual re-entered with the intention of drinking. However, if he intends to eat, he is required to wash both hands. If he left to talk to a friend and was out for some time, he should wash both hands upon his return because he was distracted. We said that entering the Beit HaMikdash, so this is a famous Rambam, Hilchot Beit HaMikdash, chapter 5. He said one may not enter the courtyard for service without first immersing, even if he is pure. And he said during the Yom Kippur service, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, immersed 5 times and sanctified his hand and feet 10 times. That's the Rambam Hilchot Avodat Yom Kippurim, chapter 2. Kulan Bakodesh, all the immersions that the high priest perform on Yom Kippur take place in the sacred area. The first immersion is an exception and may be done in the non-sacred area, as it merely ancillary immersion, so that one will remember any old impurity that he might have contacted, and it's called Tumah Yeshana, and if relevant, refrain from serving in the temple, in accordance with the way that Rabbi Yehuda said, and again that's the Rambam, Hilchot Avodat Yom Kippurim, chapter 2. Kohen Gadol Shelo Taval. So the Rambam said, how about the Kohen Gadol, the high priest that did not immerse when changing his garments, or did not sanctify his hand and feet when changing his garments? His service is still b'diavad, after the fact, valid. Kohen shelo kidesh yadav raglav, a regular Kohen who serves in the Beit HaMikdash without sanctifying his hand and feet at all, that day receives the mitah by bidei shamayim, and his services is invalid. That's applied to both Kohen Gadol and Kohen Gideon. That's the Rambam Hilchot Beit HaMikdash, chapter 5. We explained also that there is a difference between Metzora and others, the leper. The immersion the Torah speaks of the leper on the 8th day is not for the purpose of purification. Since the leper is accustomed to impurity, the concern is that he might have become impure after his previous immersion and was distracted from it, and the 8th day immersion was instituted to remind him to consider if he was exposed to impurity. That's Rambam Hilchot Mechusarei Kapara, chapter 4. The last halacha of today, we said bi'a b'miktzat. Rambam Hilchot Beit HaMikdash, chapter 3. An impure person who partially enters the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, by reaching his hands into the courtyard, so he deserves malkot for rebelliousness by rabbinic law. The Rabbi disagrees and holds that the prohibition is by Torah law and is punishable of the malkot by Torah law. The Rambam's ruling is based on the Rabbi Abahu's statement that we learn in Tractate Zvachim, where the matter is disputed and it's deemed prohibited at least by rabbinic law, and that's basically the Kesef Mishnah on the Rambam Hilchot Beit HaMikdash, chapter 3.